Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, my guests are Justin Gilpin, Caleb Little, Josh Rowe, and Adam York. If you are listening to the beginning of this podcast, please be aware that there is also a video version available on the Kansas Wheat YouTube channel. So our guest panel today consists of the CEOs of the four major Kansas commodity groups. Justin Gilpin has been CEO of Kansas Wheat since 2009. Caleb Little has been CEO of Kansas Soybeans since 2021. Josh Rowe has been the CEO of Kansas Corn since 2023. And Adam York was named the CEO of Kansas Sorghum in 2024. All of these CEOs recognize that their farmer constituents don't grow only the crop they represent, so this is a unique opportunity for all of us to have a roundtable discussion about how each group is different and what our goals are for the Kansas farmers. So, gentlemen, welcome. I think we'll start today by going around the table here and giving the listeners an idea of how your checkoff organizations work, how your association of growers work, so we get a understanding of the difference of our groups, and we'll go in reverse seniority. We'll start with Adam.
The new guy. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks, Aaron, and thanks to Kansas Wheat for having us on. As you said it, I was thinking back to the Kansas farmer and for the crop groups around the table. All four of us, for a state like Kansas, the diversification out there is really heightened comparatively to other states, and I think this is a great grouping of good individuals, good expertise. On the checkoff, you started with kind of a complicated one. Sorghum checkoff started out in the state of Kansas under the state legislature in 1976 with a dedicated commission, dedicated fixed price checkoff, but then going forward to 2008 under the Federal Commodity Promotion Research and Information Act in 1996, Congress gave USDA at the national level the authority to essentially order checkoffs into an existence. And then in 2008, the sorghum industry by petition, the National Sorghum Producers Association and the Kansas Sorghum Producers Association, all the state associations, to create the Sorghum Checkoff, what we know today as the United Sorghum Checkoff Program. So talking about the Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission really comes hand in hand with talking about the United Sorghum Checkoff Program. Kansas is the largest sorghum state in the nation. About half of the revenues from the United Sorghum Checkoff Program are those assessments in Kansas. And then the Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission, the growers of 9 that represent the different geographies across the state, then administer a pass-back revenue line each year of assessments that were collected in the state in arrears, essentially. So that makes planning from the commission's standpoint relatively simple, and we know what the year ahead is going to look like based on production and potential markets or current markets. And then really we, by August, have a figure based on USDA reports, what we expect to have as far as what can be reinvested back into the promotion research or market development in the crop for the next fiscal year. So that's it in a nutshell. 2 layers, state and federal. We work very closely with our national checkoff partners from the Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission and the farmers who make up those elected seats.
Really good summary, Josh.
Yeah, so kind of switching things to something more similar than the Wheat Commission. Kansas Corn Commission it's a state checkoff program through there. Our checkoff rate, it's a fixed rate. It's 1 penny per bushel that all first purchasers, not only in the state of Kansas, but outside of the state, collect that checkoff on. We have, like the others, we have 9 farmer-elected Kansas corn commissioners that for the 9 crop reporting district around the area. And so kind of that major focus is kind of market development and research, and then our seed to stem education program, kind of the major buckets of the commission. On the association front, it's in state law. You cannot use any checkoff funds for lobbying, any type of political advocacy work through there, and so that's the birth of the association. We have a bit over 1,000 dues-paying members to that, and that is kind of a lot more of our advocacy work comes out of that bucket through there.
I'd say soybeans, probably most similar to sorghum, sitting at this table where we had a state soybean checkoff prior to the national checkoff passing. The good news is that among all of our commodities, the what can checkoff do and what can checkoff not do are the same. So no lobbying work, no government affairs work at the state or national level with those checkoff dollars. So that's where your Soybean Association comes in on that side of things. The mechanisms are just a little bit different on the soybean checkoff side. Again, since we're a national checkoff program, half of 1% of the net market value when soybeans are sold for the first time, and only that first point of sale. So 0.5%. I think, and in my opinion, and talking to a lot of our grower leaders, that percentage was pretty thoughtful. When times are good, revenue collections on the checkoff side are a little higher, and you can have a little bit more robust programming there. But also when commodity prices are down, farmers aren't paying as much, on that checkoff. So it's kind of scalable with the markets, and essentially incentivizes the checkoff to do well, right? Build markets, increase value for farmers, be able to do bigger and better program. From the soybean side, same types of things on the checkoff programs: market development, outreach, education, research, development, those types of things.
For wheat, Aaron, you and I tell this story a lot. It's a good story to tell, so we try to go back to the beginning and the genesis of our Kansas Association of Wheat Growers leaders that actually went to the state legislature in the 1950s. And you think about that time frame, it was right after World War II. A lot of reconstruction efforts going on in Europe, and our grower leaders, Herb Clutter was one of the major ones from Southwest Kansas, went to the state legislature, and collectively they wanted to think of a mechanism, a way that our farmers could promote our product across the state. So it was in 1957 when the Kansas state legislature passed the Kansas Wheat Act that established the Kansas Wheat Commission, that has evolved to the Kansas Commodity Commission, that set up a similar structure with grower leaders that are now elected across the crop reporting districts that serve on the commissions to be our leaders. Now, on our association side, that's been around, going on to over 70 years now, that is still a membership-based board of directors that are elected across the state. And fortunately with wheat, we've gone to a structure where we have a memorandum of understanding, where we have two separate organizations, two separate boards, but we try to work closer together through the cooperative agreement between the commission and the association. It puts us in a situation where our grower leaders, we can have joint meetings several times a year, two separate boards, but when there's common interests, common goals, they make sure we're aligned on specific interests, and that's worked out really, really well and efficient from our side. And like you said, when you open this up, so many of those leaders that we deal with, whether it's in soybeans, corn, sorghum, or wheat, we're very fortunate in Kansas where our cropping systems, our farmers are very diversified, growing multiple crops and in their best interest from the soils and cropping and pest management, having those cropping rotations. So it's really important that our associations or commodity partners are working together, whether it's research, market and promotion, or advocacy on those fronts, because we're dealing with representing the same farmer, and especially at a time like we're going through right now, where there's just so much attention on the ag economy. It's that much more important that commodity groups are working together to try to work through these challenges that we're going through from a ag economy standpoint, and try to do things we can collectively to try to help add value that's going to impact, at the end of the day, what our main goal is, representing farmers and add value back to the farmer.
Yeah, I was just cut in a bit here, but was just thinking through that as others were talking, especially, coordination among the commodities there, but especially thinking on the association side. We all have our, badge and our name that, you work for corn, soybeans, wheat, and that. But I look at over the years, so I've been, with corn since 2018 and, Department of Ag prior to that. But since coming over to the commodity side, I think no less than at least 6 to 10 times a year, even at the state house level, we're all, our logos are all on the same piece of testimony there for the same thing, because it's far beyond what we're lobbying for our individual commodities. I know we've joint testimony together on things such as some healthcare issues, on rural housing, of course property taxes and pieces there, but it's all the same.
Adam, you used to work in the legislative arena, so you've had the perspective of observing all these different commodity groups from that perspective. And so just to build on what Josh just said, are there character differences between the groups, and what are the similarities?
So speaking back to that history, I'd worked in Congress in the Kansas delegation since 2013, right after graduating K-State, went out to D.C. on an internship and stayed out there for a number of years and worked up the congressional staff ladder. But, that was an opportunity where those congressional staffers, speaking from the association side, are covering a lot. They go into the office. They don't know what they're going to be reacting to that day or that hour, but it was a real treat to get any Kansan in the office, especially if they were coming from a crop group, a crop association that family members had been involved with. As a farm kid in western Kansas myself, to see the crops coming in that day was a breath of fresh air. A lot of respects, because you go in the office on the morning commute, you don't talk to anyone on the metro, and then you sit down and essentially you have an embassy in DC, and then all you really want to do is receive your fellow Kansans that day. And so it was a real treat to have Justin, and it was Dan Hetty at the time working your government affairs relations for the association at that time. Josh and Caleb and Dennis, Corn Association and Soybean Association coming in. So it was a real treat to get to hear with you. Kept us grounded as staff in DC about what y'all were doing back in the fields and seeing and needing. But on the other side, now that I am sitting at this table, I got to work with you all really and understand how to, run the association space in the state, how to talk crops with farmers. And so, we think about what those associations are able to do, where the checkoff dollars can't impress firmly enough the amount of impact that those voices have in DC and then back in the field.
Yeah, for the record, Aaron, I think you're going to add one listener probably now with the Daniel Hetty name drop in this episode. So we'll get him on there, unless Dave edits it out. We probably work with that.
Taught me everything I know.
I think it does go. Barry Flinchbaugh always talked about that fraternity of K-Staters or ag folks that are involved in the industry, and I think you gave the tenure of how long each one of us have been in this position, but I think as long as we've known each other throughout our careers, whatever positions each one of us has been in, starting out as interns and then working our way up, I feel really fortunate to be able to work with such a good group of people that are so passionate about the same thing at the end of the day that we're all looking for, and that's trying to advance Kansas agriculture.
So let's jump into the special place that Kansas is. Sometimes as commodity organizations we get lumped in with the I states. Yep. I know guys like corn and sorghum and soybeans kind of feel that. So Caleb, the unique situation we have here in the High Plains, you represent soybeans, which you're kind of on the western fringe of the soybean belt here in Kansas. How do you stand your ground as a Kansas organization in those settings?
That's a great question. I was actually just on a trade mission last week, which we can circle back around to, but was traveling with some folks from Nebraska, North Dakota, and some other states as well. And so we were just kind of talking about that as like, hey, that we're the Plains states. This is different. We're not a Iowa, Indiana, Illinois. Comes to, the cropping systems and the issues they have and the challenges. And gosh, it's minus 20 basis in Des Moines right now. What's a minus $1.90 in the Dakotas for soybeans this week? So totally different. But one of the things that we always get complimented on is Kansas agriculture punching above our weight class, especially in Washington, D.C. We're fortunate that when we go into those Hill offices, we're meeting with people who we've had Barry Flinchbaugh's class with. We're meeting with people who is a cousin of somebody we know, or somebody who grew up in a hometown, 2 towns over from us, that know the issues and they understand the rural areas and they understand Kansas and they understand agriculture and how important agriculture is. So you're talking to people that you have real relationships with. To me, that goes a really long way, because not only do they believe the information and the story that you bring to the table on a certain issue, but to get a phone call, to get a personal phone call from a Hill staffer that says, oh my gosh, I've got this blowing up, or this is coming across my desk. What does this mean to our Kansas farmer friends? And just to have that in the back of their mind as frequently as they do because of those relationships is tremendously valuable to our soybean farmers. Some of our colleagues in the I states, they may do a Hill visit with 15 other folks, at the same time. So, and not on a first name basis with their Hill staffers or with their members of Congress, like we are here. So just a tremendous value in the relationships we bring and just how important agriculture is to the state, it really brings it to the top.
Josh, I think issues that come to the forefront when you're trying to remind people that things are different here in the High Plains, especially with corn and soybeans, is like the renewable aviation fuel issue.
Yeah, and I think that's a great one there. And the kind of the climactic challenges that Kansas has, or that our growers have, can really be used as a benefit when we're talking policy front. I mean, I don't know how many times I will say the word advocating in D.C. or talking to staffers is how a one-size-fits-all approach does not work. Just because you're hearing this is going to work in the I states doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work at all. Pick kind of one of all of our favorite issues, or something that's always up there, tends to be the darling of the conservationists now, are cover crops, right? And talking about different cover crops, being requirements for this program, or if you want to get this amount of cost share through there. One of my favorite things to say in Kansas is, we've been planting over 7 million acres of a crop that grows all winter long. Have you ever tried wheat, right? And saying you guys are a cover crop, but it's just to show that, when you get in the eastern Kansas front, there are a lot of similarities to those kind of I-state production practices, but as we move across the geographical differences through there, and so we really can be that squeaky wheel when they're trying to oversimplify a policy or a piece there. And so that's really what that climactic kind of mentioned. You just get into this in the biofuel space, especially, just the differences we have, and sometimes really using them to our advantage. A lot of the I states, when they're working on biofuel policy, they don't have a robust oil and gas industry like Kansas does. And we've, all along, we've known that you have to work with the oil industry to get, anything done at the state level through there. It's a very foreign concept to some of our I-staters there, and especially now and through that. In fact, I'm going to be in D.C. later this week and preparing some talking points memos for both of our senators. Wanted these. This was at a request from both staff, is really looking at tax credits going forward, the 45Z tax credits, the 40B. When you get down through that, as those rules are getting written, what's going to benefit Kansas producers out there? And I'm writing those talking points with my farmer hat on, not as the corn guy through there, because that's a big piece there. Because if those get written in a way that with certain practices that don't qualify, we're going to be left on the fringes. But luckily we really do push over our weight, because I think we are that good barometer that if it's going to work in a Kansas system, it's going to be flexible enough, so it's going to work for the I states and then our even further out western growers as well.
To double on, Josh, to flip that into advocacy within the private markets, right, where our checkoffs are set up to really go out into the supply chain and really bring that message forward on behalf of the producer. That had a role working at our national checkoff the last couple of years as sustainability director, and when sustainability was an increasing buzzword over the first half of this decade. And it was really eye-opening to hear some of those civil society groups that want to put out some of these practices as though it were a one-size-fits-all national coast-to-coast option for farmers. And the question mark was, why aren't farmers just doing that? But then the roles, I think, for many of us in going and talking with those, they are partners in a big way, but certainly differentiated segments along the supply chain, is to say, well, it's great that you have this menu here, but let's template that back to what is actually possible on the Kansas farm, and then cross off this, and this, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's just not feasible. So if you're going to be going to the farm first and foremost, and my job was sort of in that gray area between farmer and essentially the good society groups, and talk back to one another about what I was working on with either one. But really where the rubber met the road was talking with a group of farmers, hearing what their day in and day out production was, and then helping to shape those conversations within those conferences or summits that were in Phoenix or a destination location across the nation, to say, this is all well and good that you're you're looking at these very good production practices, but do they scale? Are they able to meet the entirety of U.S. farms, and especially Kansas farms? And I think that's one of the values that farmers really should appreciate from their checkoff staff, is taking that inherent knowledge and then being able to reverberate it out across the supply chain, so that really those programs, when they do come back, are templated and are calibrated and are validated back to the farm.
Well, I think it's a great question, especially when you think about the differences in commodities across the United States. Wheat is a little bit more unique when it comes to that, just because there's multiple classes across the growing region, and whether you have a spring wheat, a soft red winter in the Corn Belt, or a hard red winter wheat, the largest grown class in the United States, or even soft white wheat that's out on the P&W, makes it a little bit more complex when we're talking about working with our other states at the national level, but makes it that much more important, especially when we talk about the promotion side and working with our export customers, because each export customer through U.S. Wheat Associates might have a different use or different specific end product that we really need to work with on the wheat side of things. And so carrying that message from the state level and making sure that we have a strong voice and strong leadership that's coming from our grower and commission leaders at the national level to communicate that in that a little bit more complex environment at the national level makes it that much more important. And even when not just through whether it's USEC or Grains Council or however we're doing our national promotion or with our national partners, we're so fortunate for all of us to have the International Grains Program located right here at Kansas State University, and that our commissions are able to work with and see buyers that are coming in for short courses, whether it's for technical training assistance or for purchasing. Just recently in the last month, we had the opportunity, just as an example, a buyer from Mexico that was at an International Grains Program that has flour mills, but then also has feeding operations. And so being able to not only represent farmers that are growing multiple crops, we're able to touch on buyers that are looking at purchasing multiple crops. So that's a real advantage that I believe we have working together, and here in Kansas specifically, and being able to hit on those notes.
Let's jump into the market situation. Let's assume we have Farmer John in Great Bend, Kansas, who just happens to be growing all four commodities represented here. So let's go around the table, and if you were talking to him and say what the market situation is and what maybe you would be hearing from him for each commodity. You want me to pick on you first?
Sure, let's go on this. So I got my scruples in sorghum in the 2018 trade war, so I've got a lot more grays in my beard than I did then, but we've learned a little bit of lesson from 2018-19, and certainly I think the message is we've been here before, and following that initial skirmish with a main buyer that dropped out like we have currently, is that we had one of the most profitable crops in the market year 2020, 2021, and 2021, 2022. Certainly that was a number of years ago, but the opportunities to diversify I think are there. We have a number of trade teams coming through IGP, the International Grains Program, in collaboration with U.S. Grains Council. We've got 43 buyers across 12 nations coming in the next 8 days into Kansas. And we're a small staff at Kansas Sorghum, so this has been about a 2 to 3 month lead time workup, all coming off the back of Export Sorghum, which is a marquee biennial event that just happens to be hitting at the exact right time that we need buyers into the state to showcase. They'll see grain sorghum, they also see corn, they'll see soybeans, but specifically for grain sorghum, we have had over the last decade now, since about 2014, through the work of the sorghum checkoff, unlocking premium markets at a tier that stands alone in China, and certainly with the geopolitical tensions, that market has closed off over the last 9 months, but every issuance of essentially positive feedback between the two nations is essentially a ray of optimism that I think we can see. But at the same time, I think we've been preparing for a couple of years at least for this potential where we could be at with an incredible crop coming off. 10 million metric tons is the sorghum production in trade terms, about half of that in Kansas, and essentially that 5 million metric tons is typically what gets exported year out. And I think this last market year that just closed a couple weeks ago, we only had about 1.7 million metric tons. So it's certainly down about 80% of where we were expected when farmers planted old crop last year. With this new crop coming off, phenomenal rains across the state, phenomenal production, elite genetics powered by the sorghum checkoff, really good yields coming out. We've got to find homes for it ASAP. I think we got to move 200 million bushels in the next 150 days. So those nations coming in, we do have China coming into western Kansas where they're going to be seeing a phenomenal crop where that dynamic could turn on a dime. We do have a team of Mexicans coming in historically over the last half century, our institutional buyer. That's right there south of the border where those unit trains can ship out. But we also have Vietnam, which is an exciting new market potential, and their catfish feeding and some of the trials that the Sorghum checkoff has done on aquaculture right here at K-State with Industry and Grain Science Department PIs leading that charge. And then we have a diversified team coming at the tail end of next week from Spain, Morocco, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and that represents end uses from swine and especially in Spain with Iberian ham, and looking at sorghum as a feed grain there. Spain specifically has come in this last marketing year with about 230 metric tons of grain sorghum. That's meaningful. Anything over 100,000 metric tons is meaningful, and so that's where I would send that ray of optimism back to the farmer listening in central Kansas that grows all of our crops, but really from border to border in the state, we'll have close to 50 buyers coming in to showcase a quality product.
Justin.
Well, that's a great story, and I know we're all paying attention to that, the number of buyers that are going to be coming through. I know some of our farmers are going to be participating in some of those meetings, and pretty excited and knowing the challenges that we're seeing at the cash price level, not just for wheat, but for all of our commodities right now. It's one of the challenging times where we have the low cash prices with still elevated input prices, and it's really gotten a heightened sense of awareness with some of the national publications and articles and that have come out just within the last 7 days. That's getting a lot of attention, and so we're really focused on trying to drive that market component, right? Developing markets and getting those markets isn't going to be the silver bullet that's going to solve our issues, but it can be one of those that we can try to influence to try to help us get out of this situation that we're in right now. We are seeing that from a trade team perspective and seeing that international demand. Wheat's a little bit more unique in the fact that 90% of our export business is spread out over 20 different countries, and so we haven't been as directly impacted on the wheat front with the China retaliatory tariffs and that situation, how they're kind of leveraging agriculture back on the administration, it feels like, clearly. We did have a East African trade team that was in last week and we did a farm visit, and they were able to purchase some hard red winter wheat while they're on the trip, and so that was great to see. But those are just the things we got to keep grinding on that, getting our bushels and moving them, and how important those export markets are, and developing those relationships, because as we talked about a week ago, the export market development game, it's a long play, right? I mean, we need things to happen in the next 120 days, but we need those things to be established and be consistent for our farmers over the next 5 to 7 years. And so we're pretty excited about, on the wheat front, seeing some of the memorandums of understanding that have been signed. I know you've talked about on your podcast several times, Aaron, with Indonesia and Bangladesh and Vietnam, and potentially something coming with South Korea. I mean, those are all the types of agreements that we need in place to make sure that we have commitments for our farmers, that we have bushels to go to, because of that export market is so important. And again, that's the one piece that we can try to influence, and then the other aspects of what's affecting our overall ag economy and our returns that are back to farmers right now. That's also the inflationary on the input prices and not staying high, and those challenges that we're dealing with. Those are consistent themes around all of our board tables with our farmers that we're as an organization is going to be working on.
Yeah, absolutely. Same story for soybeans. It's hard to be extremely optimistic and be too over the top with success stories and those types of things when farmers are dealing with what they're dealing with at the farm gate. Like Justin said, it's that long-term play. That's what your checkoffs are here for. It's for that long-term market building, demand building, those types of things. When we think about the soybean crop domestically, about half of what we produce gets used here in the United States. The other half gets exported to international markets. Of that half that goes to international markets, about half of that goes to China in a normal year. Pre-2018 trade war, that was more like 70%. So glass half full, 2018 trade war with China, we diversified our international markets significantly from that. So we're going into soybeans, and soybean products are going into a lot more countries, a lot more markets than they were before. Kind of buried in the news of 0 new crop purchases from China, buried in that news is all other destinations are actually up this year for soybean exports. So again, it's a good story from the checkoff side because of that market development work. However, obviously, half your crop sitting unpurchased is going to have more an effect than the other side of it. So we think about that. We also think last year was record year for biofuels production in the United States, and we're seeing that actually drive new soybean processing, almost 30% expansion in soy crush in the United States over the last couple of years here, and especially kind of that western corn belt. So, Bartlett and Cherryvale, the Goodland Schooler plant here in Kansas. So significant market drivers and value add for our soybean producers here in the state. So 30% new crush in the state. The idea behind that should add some basis. That should help our local farmers quite a bit, increase some local demand at the same time as we're diversifying those international markets. So the hope is that on the back side of this, when we come out of the current market space that we're in, that we're going to be even better positioned for our soybean producers coming out of that.
On a corn front, just what's driving the markets is, the U.S. has never produced a 16 billion bushel crop before and predicted to blow, right past that, closer to 17 billion. The latest is 16.8 billion. That same thing calls for Kansas, just these timely rains. And it's just almost, mind-blowing through that. I know up on my own farm, we were planting into the dust in early April in north central Kansas, which we usually have some moisture to plant into, so low hopes. And, I've set 3 of the 4 fields we've taken out for wet corn have set, yield records. So bushels are driving things through with that. And so there's just a glut of corn coming onto the market. Luckily, the marketing year that just closed the end of August exported more corn than you set a record for whole corn export out of the U.S. at close to 2.8 billion bushels of corn. On the biofuel front, it's been a really fastly growing export side of thing, exported over 2 billion gallons of ethanol for the first time ever. And we look into this next market year, that's already cooked into these USDA numbers. So it's that good or bad thing. And so USDA has forecasted corn exports even higher than last year, which was already a record. Last week's WASDE increased it by another 100 million bushels of corn exports. So, really thank goodness for the export side of and the work that has been done building those markets there, because things could be a lot more dire. But that isn't to say, we're looking at record corn exports and the struggles and, soybeans and especially sorghum. That all, plays into things. When that sorghum is not moving to China and it's getting piled in western Kansas, being utilized by those end users, it impacts basis there. And then even in other states, I tell my counterparts in other states, Nebraska and especially Iowa, they've gotten pretty used to sending unit trains of corn into western Kansas, for the better basis play. And I'm like, I don't think they're going to need it this year, unless some things move. So it's all through there. As Caleb mentioned, domestic ethanol production just continues to be a strong point. We're up year over year. We're not, Americans, we're not back to pre-COVID levels for domestic demand, but that export market has filled it in. If there is that one big drag, especially from a Kansas point now, is that beef herd has not been rebuilding. It's just frustrating to see, last year further declines, and you just see those cattle on feed reports where, that typical Kansas feedlots, 96% of where they were a year ago, which was a lower, and that's a trend that we can't see. Back to that, looking at those, just what I look at in the future for markets, I think a country that's in the news nationally kind of for the wrong reasons. Another one mentions India, because I see huge potential for all 4 of our commodities here. I know they've been impossible to work with on the wheat side. You guys have had your issues there. They absolutely won't take whole corn or soybeans because of GM issues through there. I think sorghum's
50% tariff and some phytosanitary issues.
Sorghum's it's there, and I've been told, contacts USTR, that every one of those potential trade deals, as it's hit the president's desk, nothing's been signed due to extraneous issues. Has included sorghum, it has included soybean meal and DDGs, so it's there, it's that close. Kansas Corn Commission is invested in a big way through the U.S. Grains Council. We're the kind of primary sponsor of an office that Grains Council stood up to have some in-country people through there, and investment they made just right kind of during that COVID era through that. It's a long-term plan on these export markets.
Yeah, most populous country in the world right now, but it's certainly complicated with multiple issues. That does bring up a headline that I did see last week with India's neighbor with Pakistan with a recent announcement, I believe was commercial business with sorghum due to some recent flooding, their needs for commodities. There was a recent, I think it was a commercial purchase. I don't think it was food aid, but might lead into a food aid discussion if we wanted to touch on it. But I don't know, could you tell us a little bit more about? I heard Amy France, one of your leaders. She does a really good job. I heard her speaking about it. I think it was on the radio or a podcast. I heard her talking about the situation and markets, and you're fortunate to have that good leadership on these things, but specifically on that Pakistan, I don't know if you could enlighten us a little bit about that.
That one was surprising. I think we'll take it, but yeah. I don't have any more details other than that. But on the India thing, Pakistan, India, that really southern Asia region certainly is a pivot for U.S. grain sorghum exports. Again, half of it going out to exports, most of that going to China. Yeah, that presents an opportunity here where we will see some diversification in grain sorghum bushels moving. We'll take Pakistan. We don't necessarily have programming in Pakistan, but at this price that old crop has been and new crop coming off, I think it showcased that it is a product that buyers still want across the nation. And certainly I think working with the administration, working with where USDA FAS has presence in, certainly looking at what faculties are available to help move these bushels. So we talk about market promotion through the checkoffs. We talk about, bringing in trade teams, but certainly when the association specifically can stand up and go and talk in with our administration, there are some levers that can be looked at that way and helping to get the word out through just the infrastructure that the United States has globally that's built up since post-World War II.
Well, Justin, you teed it up, the food aid market. What's the future?
Well, I think as we're talking about markets and commercial markets, and we're in a situation where we are trying to find ways to help out our ag economy by moving bushels that we're producing, and Kansas is on the front of that because of the long history that Kansas has with food aid programs. And we're doing a food aid fly-in right now with industry and growers that are in Washington, D.C. that specifically are talking about potentially that historic program, Food for Peace program, moving that over to USDA with kind of the dismantling that's happened with USAID, and USDA would manage that program, that over $1 billion that could be spent on U.S. commodities that could go to humanitarian efforts, that then the velocity of that dollar that would help our bushels be moving, that are moved by U.S. out of U.S. communities and U.S. handlers, U.S. exporters. So there's just, it's a good expense of that taxpayer dollars to help those that are in need. And so that's really a forefront that we talk about on how all of our commodities can participate in that. And, with this administration wanting to kind of reshape what humanitarian programs look like and what that overseas engagement with those that are food insecure, I think it's really important that there's things we probably don't even have to reinvent. And if we look at whether it's concessional sales through Title I programs that's gone away for a long time, and currency, and such a big issue right now that could be a program that's already on the books that we might be able to revisit and to look at on how we might be able to participate on some of those Title I programs that haven't been utilized for a long time, in a way of getting some of our commodities to be able to move into humanitarian assistance and help build on how the current administration wants to reshape how those programs work, and thinking, what's going to make America a safer, more prosperous type situation and more secure. Certainly food aid and humanitarian assistance play a key part in that.
Back on domestic policy, the big, beautiful farm bill, whatever you want to call that was passed, does have some benefit in it for farmers, improvement, reference prices, insurance premiums, things like that, but not until 2026. What can the administration do in the short term bridge that gap?
It's an interesting thing, and our number one mantra is, our producers, and I think all of our members would agree to this. It's more about, markets than aid, right? Whether that be domestic or that, just get the government out of the way. Let us, let us farm would be kind of the mantra through there. But it always seems to be our kind of all of our southern counterparts or whatever have been, I think, hard at work for another disaster type set of payments that coming towards the end of the year is what I hear.
Yeah, definitely the conversation from our side as well, where it's they would much rather have the markets and much do it that way. However, if a trade package or if an aid package is going to help get a certain percentage of producers to the next year, that's certainly going to be necessary. So there's conversation around it in D.C., so watching it close, heard on the radio on the drive over, unfortunately, talk about, skinny farm bill. I mean, that's like 2 weeks away or less. I don't really know what they're going to get done, and they're talking about a continuing resolution and funding the government, and DC's just got a lot of work to get done here at the end of the year. So, but if some type of agricultural aid is what's necessary to, like I say, get producers to the next growing season, to the next year, it's going to be hard to turn that away.
Yeah, I have a association board member who grows all the crops, and he's quick to say farmers are survivors, and so surviving from one season to the next season, survivability is paramount. And I think the growers that we all represent around the table have been appreciative of the economic and disaster assistance that came out and administered very well in Kansas by FSA. Certainly, I think those market movements, those market signals will create a wide latitude of optimism across the countryside.
Let's shift real quick to talking a little bit about research emphasis. Some of the commodity groups at this table have a lot more value-added component to what their research is priority-wise. I'll just throw it out there. What are some of the research priorities for some of your groups?
So Sorghum Commission typically invests about 60 to 70% of our annual budget into research at K-State in agronomy and industry and grain science, and then plant pathology. Sorghum specifically has had a decadal challenge of investing from private R&D to help advance the crop. So the mantra from the Sorghum Checkoff, and certainly for the Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission in a number of years, has been invest in research for Kansas by Kansas here in Kansas. And so we have a Center for Sorghum Improvement at K-State run by Dr. Sarah Sexton-Bowser that it is a lot of things, but really at its core, it is a leverage engine to go out and focus that farmer checkoff dollar and match it $1, $2, $3, $4 from private sources, federal sources, state sources. Really anyone who wants to play in the game for sorghum improvement, all harnessed and targeted towards sorghum crop genetic advancement back out to the fields. And so we've seen some hallmark wins with that program, with sugarcane aphid having some exotic material coming in from Eastern Africa, that within a single breeding cycle, sorghum as a non-GMO, we couldn't simply drop in foreign material, had to go out and find out which pockets of the world exotic sorghum may have had a resistance. That takes screening and dollars for parental lines. And then really within a single breeding cycle through the molecular breeding program here at K-State, I was able to go in with scissors, pull that out, plant it into two parent lines, get a child that was sugarcane aphid resistant, and essentially solve that problem for growers out in the field. So a great return on investment over the last couple of years, certainly seeing a need to look at where in the market development space we might be able to then take those funds and maybe reinvest as we do build up this engine with the Center for Sorghum Improvement at K-State to help us tackle this research need. Farmer dollars could then be more utilized towards market development aspects in that way.
Good stuff.
Well, I'm talking to the guy at the Kansas Wheat office that kind of oversees research. That's a little pressure on me to answer this question,
I'll take
I guess.
Notes.
But I think one of the most visible things of the checkoff is that investment back into research, and how can we use genetics to help solve problems for farmers to make advancements. And clearly we're coming off of a year where we need to be doing that in wheat, where we had changes or more widespread virus. That variety selection and variety development could help combat, along with management practices, the wheat streak mosaic virus or trim V or high plains mosaic. So getting those new varieties and having that investment and helping support the programs and with our partners here at Kansas State University and researchers are so important. At the national level, we've been fortunate to be able to work with USDA NEFA, where in 2018 they had the Commodity Board Matching Grant, where we've been able to participate in Kansas with several of our researchers, and where you could leverage those checkoff dollars, a one-for-one with USDA dollars, to fund specific research, and having the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center where we can help house some of those research and giving us the capacity that we hadn't had in past decades to help advance wheat genetics. I think it's been pretty exciting to see. We talked about marketing being a long-term game. Certainly research is a long-term game, but it's one of the most visible things, I think, when producers recognize the checkoff investment that they're making, that it's not only the promotion and market development side of things, there is that strong research component, especially with wheat.
Soybeans is similar. For sure, obviously that research component is a big piece of that. We're maybe slightly different where I'd say it's probably safe to characterize that the industry does a lot of the heavy lifting on the genetic side, but that doesn't mean that it's not critically important for us to do that testing of what's the impact of those systems or those cropping systems here in Kansas for soybean growers. So obviously pests, water, drought, heat, timing types of things are all studied every year. We do a lot of that work through K-State. We do have a few investments through Central Soybean Research Collaborative Organization. Again, kind of talking back to those plain states, our issues that, the Dakotas and us and Nebraska face maybe are a little bit different than what our national checkoff is studying. But also our growers really took the opportunity to kind of lean into the building initiative here at K-State. So that Ag Innovation Initiative in the early days, really our board saw the value in that we have really great human capital here at K-State and really good technical ability, but the facilities were severely lacking, probably across all the ag departments, especially in the agronomy space. They were early to jump in that investment space there. It's really cool to see that, just driving up this morning to your guys' building, seeing building progress in that North Agronomy farm.
I think similar to soybeans, a lot of all that, the genetics, all that development, it's done by industry. Actually, before, even I was with corn, our commission had kind of started that switch from research funding, maybe less of that traditional production research that we think of, and more of that switch towards the kind of the market development, that value added side of that, and continuing to go. I have 2 staff members up at an Ag Bio Innovations Conference in Omaha right now as we speak. They're just kind of looking not only on that research side, but kind of dipping our toes a bit into more of that investment. Some of those startup companies that are, many steps beyond the research. That research is the long game, but some of those companies that are ready to scale now, we're not making individual investments as Kansas Corn, but groups of states getting together to kind of share that risk through there. But that that doesn't say we've been really responsive on kind of needed in-state research. Had to really ramp up the last 2 seasons with some newer corn pests, particularly corn stunt, tar spot, just name that had came through there, and getting some resources in a pretty expedited manner to K-State to come up with some deficiencies that they had in this space. So we're getting the best information out there and in front of things. But it really has been a market shift, because just as producers have been kind of under that attitude, especially our commissioners, is the crop's there, the corn pile's growing, do something to get rid of it through there. And this isn't meant for a dig at K-State any, but as we're sitting now, since January, we've not had a row crop production specialist in our Department of Agronomy, which is pretty, and I don't know if we're sitting here a year from now if we will have one. There's a lot of holes missing, a lot of interims, happen in K-State's Department of Ag. And so I guess luckily for a lot of that other research is happening beyond where we're sitting at now, because it'd be pretty dire if we were depending solely on K-State crop production research now, and especially corn and soybean side.
And I think just to kind of add on to that too, the one of the things that our associations and our checkoffs both, so the checkoffs are investing in that direct research, but we get the question all the time from the farmers of like, hey, what's coming down the pipeline at the big companies? Well, having a relationship with them from the association side actually gives us a little bit of a view into that. Maybe not perfect, but it can also give us the voice to say, we know you guys are doing this. Please partner with our local land grants so that they're not in the dark, and so that they can be, because one of the biggest criticisms that the universities get on the agronomy side, and in my opinion on the research side, is, well, you're studying something we already know the answer to, right? Well, how do they get out of that box? It's having those contacts at the companies, actually having those conversations with them, so that they're not studying something that the company or your local seed guy already knows the answer to, but hasn't told anybody, right? So that's where that research and extension piece, and especially the extension side, in my opinion, can really go a long way. And thankfully, all the folks sitting around this table have an ear and have an audience with those seed groups to say, hey, look, guys, make sure you're getting this out to the farmer, not just to your customers.
Yeah, duplication of effort can't happen. Duplication of effort can't happen, but also commercialization has to happen of that research. Yeah. Research for research's sake is great when you're in the public institution world, but for the farmers who are investing in it, there has to be some sort of bridging of that gap to get it back to the field so that it is a return on investment to the farmer. And then that commercialization piece typically has been a challenge in the sorghum world, but specifically here through K-State, through the Center for Sorghum Improvement, working with the private seed companies, with the public researchers, just to go out a box wider. The Center for Sorghum Improvement doesn't just work with purple institutions. It works with any public land grant organization because it is, in effect, funded by our national checkoff in a big way as well. So that helps mitigate that duplication of effort that we mentioned, certainly helps with that crosstalk about what's needed and who's working on what, and then allows for that specialization. I think we've got drought tolerance and cold season tolerance happening at Iowa State University on sorghum, speaking about the I-States and some of that work, which, as a Kansan, you're looking at it and you're like, that's interesting. But really, when you're working on behalf of the farmer, especially in a crop that's as concentrated among the high plains as sorghum, it's what raises the tide, what raises that boat for the farmer, then allows them, again, that survivability piece to make it to the next crop cycle.
Right. And so I think Josh brought up a really good point about how it is an important time to use our organizations and our leaderships as K-State's going through some leadership transition and evolution with how research and extension may be working in the future versus how they have in the past. I think it's really important that our representation from Western Kansas and making sure that we're providing that input and what's going to be important to our ag stakeholders going forward. And because there are certainly issues about trying to do whether it's something novel in markets and trying to add value, but then as a state, some bigger issues that I think we need to make sure that our research is aligned in the cropping systems and water issues and pest management, that it's going to be really important that we have an actively engaged research and extension for our growers here in Kansas.
That's a nice segue to the last question I was going to toss out there, Justin, and anyone can take this. How did these commodity groups work together to get a seat at the table regarding the water issue in Kansas?
I would say first and foremost, I think our commodity groups have done a nice job in being, and Josh has a long history with working with kind of on policy efforts and management efforts and trying to raise awareness of challenges that we potentially face as a state, not just in agriculture, but through our communities and industries. With the water issue, I think it's going to be that much more important as we go forward. As you said, how do we work together in cropping systems and how that's going to impact it, how it's going to impact our industries, and make sure that we're doing it in a meaningful way that's not going to be completely disruptive to the economies that are out there right now. But what would be most disruptive to the economies and communities is the depletion of that water. So I would say that to my colleagues here, I think they've been very active and engaged on that front, but it's going to extremely be more important clearly in the immediate future.
I fully agree, through that, just kind of that engagement. And it just goes back to, I used these words before, use them too much, kind of that one-size-fits-all approach, because Kansas is prime example of that, some policy that, is just meant to, you hear, not to get down in the weeds too much, but I hear it thrown around Topeka every session. You got to tamp it down. Well, farmers need to remove end guns on all their pivots. You know what I mean? It's like, that's like kind of this silver bullet. It's going to do it. And that's got some benefits because there is some inefficiencies. I'm an irrigator myself with that end gun. If you're in a very constrained water system, absolutely, that is a really good use of your water. Got to look. We irrigate across the state. It gets a lot less as you go to the East Coast, the east side of Kansas through that. But that is something that, when you're in a system, when there's plenty of water, there's not the water depletion through that, hindering that farmer is going to do a lot more harm than good. And then also when you just, Aaron, your question was the water issue, which we kind of automatically, you go to water quantity in Western Kansas, but water quality issues, you can be a couple of one or two bad storm systems, some bad runoff things, or you could have just as many restrictions placed on our farmers on production practices due to water quality. So that really is, we're almost stretched too thin because we have all of the water problems, it seems, in Kansas in a typical year.
Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation, I think, from the associations interacting with the policymakers, interacting with state agency to showcase, again, that ground truth. I'll go back to the comments I said at the beginning of the hour, working formally at the federal level as congressional staff to understand what is feasible on the ground and what is happening out there in the fields. And fortunately, here in 2025, no one's talking about drought. Looking at the drought monitor, Kansas is nice and well saturated. But certainly these conversations do come up again, and that's where the organizations really do pull together. Certainly we have items that for our shared farmers, need to be expressed on behalf of agriculture in Kansas. But certainly when we go outside of the state, outside of the water quantity and more into kind of the water quality issue, helping to showcase what the state is doing already and has done over years and years and years in the past with its quality of data and metrics and measuring comparatively to other states in the area, I think helps speak what the associations have already done in a big way.
Gentlemen, thank you. It's been a great discussion. We ought to do it again sometime, and I'm sure we will. Thank you to Justin Gilpin, Josh Rowe, Caleb Little, and Adam York for being guests on this episode. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for one of our guests, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. And you can find previous episodes of Wheats on Your Mind at wheatsonyourmind.com or Apple and Spotify. Thanks for joining us.